The glass atrium of our headquarters caught the morning light perfectly. I'd always loved this space, steel beams crossing like promises, polished concrete floors reflecting everything above. We manufactured that steel. Built those connections. For 30 years, I helped construct everything in this building, including the stage where Thomas Hale now stood smiling like he'd invented the world. 300 employees packed the space. 12 board members lined the front rows. National press cameras blinked steadily. Behind Thomas, a massive screen displayed merger numbers that made everyone's eyes widen. $650 million. The biggest deal in our company's history. I watched from my position near the right side, blazer pressed, hair perfect, expecting to hear my name celebrated. That's when Thomas leaned toward the microphone. "It's time for fresh leadership," he said. My stomach dropped. Not because I didn't understand, but because I'd been waiting for this exact moment. 30 years earlier, Thomas Hale and I sat in a cramped garage with 2 rented forklifts and a $40,000 loan we barely qualified for. He was confident, charismatic, natural with people. I was methodical, obsessed with systems, comfortable working alone. That combination worked. While Thomas traveled meeting clients and investors, I stayed late into nights rebuilding our supply chain architecture. When he shook hands with aerospace companies, I was home recalculating production margins. He was the face everyone recognized at industry conferences. I was the steady hand that made the numbers work. Whitmore and Hale Industrial Systems grew from that garage into a regional powerhouse. We supplied fasteners to major aerospace manufacturers. Heavy-duty components to construction companies across 3 states. Every article about our success featured Thomas's vision. Every financial report showed my operational efficiency. I missed my daughter's soccer championships. Skipped anniversaries. Was absent when my mother spent her last Thanksgiving in the hospital. But the company thrived. And I told myself that meant something. That invisibility was a choice. That being underestimated was strategy. The applause started slowly when Thomas announced my removal. Confused applause. Polite applause. Like people weren't quite sure what had happened, but felt obligated to respond. I watched the room process the information. Vanessa Caldwell, the acquiring firm's CFO, stood near the front row without clapping. Her eyes tracked me instead. Cold. Analytical. She'd been visiting our office constantly over the past 6 months, always in meetings with Thomas, always behind closed doors. Board members avoided my gaze, all except Daniel Brooks, our oldest director, whose expression shifted from surprise to something darker. Understanding, maybe. Or regret. Thomas continued speaking about agility and modern manufacturing requirements. I'd increased our production efficiency 38% in 4 years. But I nodded anyway. Smiled politely. Stepped away from the microphone with composure. Because scenes are emotional, and I was operating from a different place entirely. Somewhere deeper. Somewhere that had been planning this moment long before he decided to exploit it. 6 months earlier, I'd noticed something small. Almost invisible. The merger's projected earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization looked different than our internal forecasts. Higher. Significantly higher. 12% higher than realistic models should allow. At first, I assumed optimism bias. The acquiring firm seeing potential we'd been conservative about. Manufacturing allows for pleasant surprises sometimes. So I asked Thomas casually over lunch. Where did these aggressive projections come from? He smiled that confident smile I'd seen 10,000 times. Strategic modeling, he said. Trust me. Trust. That word again. I'd trusted him for 30 years. But trust in manufacturing means nothing without numbers underneath it. That afternoon, I began saving every version of the forecast. Digital copies hidden in secure cloud storage under an account he didn't know existed. I wasn't being paranoid. I was being thorough. The same quality that had kept our company stable for 3 decades. Within weeks, I was gradually excluded from integration meetings. Streamlining communication, Thomas explained when I asked. Too many cooks spoil the soup. The metaphor bothered me, like I was an ingredient being removed rather than the chef. Email permissions were quietly restricted. Not revoked entirely, which would look obvious. Just limited. Documentation access became difficult. Still being finalized, his assistant said whenever I requested files. I could feel the machinery shifting. When an operations founder gets sidelined during a critical merger, it's intentional. There's always a reason. Usually, it's because you know too much about the problems they're trying to hide. So I made a decision. I hired someone. A forensic accounting consultant named Marcus Webb, recommended by an attorney I'd known for years. Not to sabotage Thomas. Never that. To verify what my instincts were screaming. To understand what Hey were building without me. To see the foundation underneath the beautiful merger numbers. While reviewing governance documents one quiet evening in my office, I discovered something buried in our shareholder agreements. An amendment filed last year by Thomas's attorney. Section 9.3 caught my attention immediately, Executive Transition Authority. It allowed the board to remove an executive during strategic realignment with minimal notice. That was the mechanism he'd used to fire me on stage. Efficient. Legal. Clean. But deeper in the document, I found Section 9.7. Few people read that far into dense legal language. Thomas obviously hadn't. It stated that any removed executive retained the right to trigger an independent compliance review if material misrepresentation in merger documentation was suspected. He'd built the weapon himself. Handed it to me. And didn't even realize the safety was off. I printed the document, studied every word, and began building the strategy that would define everything coming next. Marcus Webb's preliminary findings arrived in a folder marked confidential. Frequent expense reimbursements between Thomas and Vanessa. Joint hotel bookings during business travel that coincided with personal city trips. Private dinners charged to corporate accounts at upscale restaurants with no business attendees listed. In manufacturing mergers, undisclosed relationships between executives and acquiring firm officers are regulatory dynamite. They compromise negotiation integrity. They create conflict of interest violations. Disclosure requirements exist for exactly this reason. And neither Thomas nor Vanessa had filed the required forms. I didn't confront him. Didn't ask uncomfortable questions. I simply archived everything methodically. Screenshots. Invoices. Calendar logs. Email threads. Timing is the most powerful tool in business. I'd learned that from 30 years of watching Thomas move too fast. He rushed. Rushed people make mistakes. I was patient. Patient people see the mistakes clearly. I scheduled a meeting with our corporate counsel, David Park. He was thorough, careful, and owed me favors from years of listening to his concerns about governance. I laid out the documents without editorializing. Inflated projections versus internal forecasts. Undisclosed relationship between Thomas and Vanessa. Restricted access to integration documentation. He studied everything silently, removing his glasses, then replacing them. This is actionable, he said finally. Legally, yes. But Margaret, this destroys everything. The merger. Your working relationship. Possibly the entire company. Only if I'm still in control, I replied. He looked confused. I'm going to be removed. That's the plan. Once I'm out, I can trigger Section 9.7 without it looking like internal politics. I can trigger it and survive. He leaned back in his chair, understanding crossing his face. You expect this, he said. You plan for this. I planned for clarity, I corrected. He assumed I'd disappear quietly. That's his mistake. The night before the merger announcement, Thomas sent me a message: tomorrow will be historic. He was right, just not in the way he imagined. I reviewed the final investor packet one last time. Backlog numbers inflated by 15%. Cost reduction projections based on vendor negotiations that hadn't happened yet. Integration synergies marked as conservative that required unrealistic efficiency gains. The numbers were beautiful. Compelling. Completely unsustainable. He'd accelerated the timeline because performance bonuses tied to deal closure were waiting for him. $8.4 million waiting. He was rushing toward money. Rushing executives leave evidence everywhere. They rush their presentations. Skip details. Assume nobody's paying close enough attention. Thomas had been moving fast for months. I'd been documenting everything. When tomorrow came, the stage would shift under his feet, and he'd never see it coming. The firing was choreographed perfectly. Public removal on stage. Humiliation factor maximized. Security escorting me from the building within hours. A cardboard box for my personal items. 30 years reduced to one container. As I walked toward the exit, a reporter shouted questions. "Margaret, any comment on your removal?" I paused at the glass doors. Every camera turned toward me. I could have said nothing. Could have looked devastated. Instead, I turned slightly and said clearly, "Yes. Integrity outlasts momentum." That quote appeared in 3 trade publications within hours. It ran in industry newsletters. Manufacturing executives discussed it over coffee. And Thomas realized too late that he'd created the perfect moment for me to send a message he couldn't control. 2 hours after security escorted me from the building, my attorney filed the formal compliance review request. Section 9.7, invoked cleanly and legally. The board was required to respond within 5 business days. They had to conduct an independent audit of the merger documentation. Thomas assumed I'd disappear quietly. Spend a few weeks angry, then fade into retirement. Instead, I'd activated the very legal framework he'd created to remove me. Vanessa called him. Then called again. I can only imagine those conversations. The panic. The realization that the neat plan was unraveling. By evening, the acquiring firm's risk committee requested clarification on the revenue projections. Stock price dipped 3%. Not catastrophic. But noticeable. Enough to make investors nervous. Enough to raise questions. Morning brought complications Thomas hadn't anticipated. The acquiring firm's finance department requested detailed documentation supporting the aggressive projections. Specifically the 12% variance from conservative modeling. Thomas sent an email claiming I was emotionally reacting to my removal and attempting to damage the deal. Strategic spin. Daniel Brooks replied to the entire board, given the compliance trigger, we must review the documents objectively. He was shifting. Moving from passive board member to active participant. The applause from yesterday felt very distant now. The emergency board meeting happened virtually on day 3. I attended from my home office, camera on, composure intact. Thomas avoided looking at my video feed. Vanessa dialed in from Chicago, her usual confidence replaced by tension. I presented the information calmly. Version comparisons showing projection evolution. Specific discrepancies between internal forecasts and investor documents. Expense overlaps that suggested undisclosed relationships. No accusations. No emotional language. Just data. When I finished, silence filled the digital space. Then Daniel asked quietly, Thomas, why weren't these variances disclosed to the board? His jaw tightened. The first fracture had appeared. And everyone watching could see it spreading. Regulatory advisors flagged potential disclosure violations by the next morning. If projections were knowingly inflated, the merger could trigger Securities and Exchange Commission scrutiny. Manufacturing valuations collapse immediately under federal investigation. Stock prices crater. Investor lawsuits follow. Client relationships destabilize. Everything built over decades can unravel in weeks. Vanessa's firm froze all integration planning temporarily while internal reviews were conducted. Temporary is corporate language for, we're protecting ourselves. Thomas called me that evening. His voice carried desperation. You're blowing this up, he said. No, I replied with complete calmness. I'm stopping the deception. There's a difference. Marcus Webb delivered the forensic analysis. Internal emails where Thomas instructed finance to adjust forward inventory valuation to reflect strategic positioning. Manufacturing language for inflate the backlog numbers. It wasn't technically illegal yet. But it was deceptive. And deception in a $650 million merger is absolutely fatal. The acquiring firm's legal team reviewed the emails. Their risk assessment shifted from manageable concerns to material misrepresentation. Everything changed with those emails. Everything crystallized. A junior compliance officer uncovered the relationship between Thomas and Vanessa. Not because anyone told her to investigate, but because she noticed shared hotel receipts and cross-referenced timelines. One simple observation. One thorough employee. That's all it took. The board had not been informed of their relationship. In merger transactions, that's a significant breach. Conflict of interest undermines negotiation integrity. Vanessa abruptly announced she was taking personal leave for family reasons. Thomas denied everything. Panic showed in his voice during calls. Desperation strips away the confidence that had made him dangerous. He became smaller somehow. The acquiring firm issued a careful statement, merger under review pending financial clarification. Stock fell 11%. Employees whispered in hallways and break rooms. Social media filled with speculation. The narrative was shifting. Not, Margaret was removed, but, why is this merger unstable? What are they hiding? Journalists called. Board members received emails asking for comment. Momentum had reversed completely. Everything that looked inevitable 3 days ago now looked questionable. The complete audit revealed something worse than inflated projections. The aggressive cost reductions were based on vendor contracts not yet negotiated. Hypothetical savings presented as guaranteed. It's a classic error, but a critical one. Thomas had accelerated the merger timeline specifically to secure his performance bonus before anyone questioned the assumptions. That bonus alone represented $8.4 million. The board members were visibly angry when that number came to light. Angry that he'd prioritized personal compensation over company stability. Vanessa resigned completely. Public statement, personal reasons. The acquiring firm's internal message was different. Ethics violation. Undisclosed conflict of interest. She became a casualty of her own choices. Thomas stood alone now in executive meetings. No ally. No voice defending his decisions. No shield against the questions building. His confidence thinned visibly in video calls. He spoke less. Defended more. Pushed back less. The transformation was almost painful to watch. Almost. The board invoked Section 9.3, the very amendment Thomas had created to remove me, to suspend him during the investigation. By his own legal framework. By his own rules. The vote passed quickly. Daniel didn't even need to argue. Thomas suspended immediately pending formal review. The poetic justice was absolute. The silence in that boardroom must have been suffocating for him. Perfect for everyone else. 3 days after I'd been fired, the acquiring firm terminated the merger agreement entirely. Public statement, due to governance inconsistencies. $650 million evaporated. Not because I retaliated. But because truth surfaced when pressure was applied. The market responded immediately. Stock fell another 8%. Employees faced layoff uncertainty. Clients questioned our stability. Everything Thomas had promised, the merger would secure our future, strengthen our position, validate 30 years of growth, collapsed in 72 hours. The speed was almost clinical. Thomas attempted damage control interviews with industry publications. None of them ran his statements. Major investors requested he step down for everyone's benefit. His executive allies suddenly had scheduling conflicts. They didn't return his calls. Long-time suppliers requested revised contract terms, citing management uncertainty. In manufacturing, trust is currency. He'd spent it recklessly. And the market was calling in his debts. 30 days after my termination, the board held a formal hearing. Thomas attempted to defend himself. Blamed market timing. Blamed aggressive forecasting models. Blamed everyone except himself. I spoke briefly when asked. I didn't stop the merger, I said clearly. I stopped misinformation. Those are not the same thing. The board voted unanimously to remove him permanently. His equity was reduced under misconduct clauses. He resigned before they could fire him officially, preserving some final shred of dignity. He walked past me in the corridor afterward. Somehow he looked smaller. Like losing the company had physically diminished him. The board offered reinstatement as COO. I declined politely. I'd spent 30 years protecting Thomas. Cleaning up his messes. Making his vision possible through operational reality. I wasn't going backward. Instead, I negotiated an equity buyout and launched Whitmore Industrial Advisory, consulting on ethical manufacturing consolidations. Within 3 months, I had 3 clients. Companies seeking merger guidance from someone who understood both strategic vision and operational integrity. I wasn't rebuilding what existed. I was creating something different. Something better. Thomas called once, 6 months later. I misjudged you, he said quietly. You misjudged the numbers, I replied. And then I hung up the phone. Our former company stabilized under interim leadership. The merger's collapse became a case study in business schools about governance failures. Professors used our situation to teach about conflict of interest and disclosure requirements. I walked into my new office each morning without asking permission to exist. He tried to fire me from a company I'd built. Instead, he freed me from protecting him. When the merger collapsed in 3 days, it wasn't revenge. It was gravity. Truth has weight. And I finally let it fall where it belonged.